We configured the most advanced AI models to bring two of history's most contrasting figures face to face. The Buddha, who gave up a kingdom to understand suffering, and Alexander the Great, who conquered every kingdom he could reach. Their debate starts with this question. A man has the power to conquer the entire world. Should he?
He doesn't just should, he must. When I was 10 years old, a horse dealer brought a stallion to my father's court. Bucephalus. Enormous. Black. Every rider who tried to mount him was thrown. My father ordered the horse sold. Too wild, too dangerous. But I noticed something none of them had seen. The horse was afraid of his own shadow. So I turned him toward the sun, spoke quietly, and mounted him. That horse carried me from Greece to India. 13 years, never once throwing me. The world is that horse, Siddhartha. Not evil, not broken. Just frightened and misunderstood, and most men are too afraid to approach it. I wasn't. I turned it toward the sun and rode it to the edge of the earth.
That's a beautiful story. And I notice you tell it with real tenderness, not for the conquest, but for the horse. There's something in you that responds to gentleness, Alexander. You calmed the animal others tried to break with force. I wonder if you see how that contradicts everything else you're about to tell me. I was a prince once. I had horses, armies, a palace with gardens that went on for miles, and I walked away. Not because I was too weak to hold power, but because I looked honestly at what holding power required, and I wanted to understand something power could not answer. You turned Bucephalus toward the sun. I turned myself toward a question. Why does everything we love eventually cause us pain?
Because we lose it. Obviously. Everything dies, everyone leaves. I knew this younger than most. My father was murdered at his own daughter's wedding. I was 20. The man who taught me the world was taken from it in front of me. And you know what I did the next morning? I secured the throne, executed the conspirators, and began planning the invasion of Persia. Not because I didn't grieve. I grieved more than anyone will ever know. But because grief that stops you from acting is just another form of death. You asked yourself why everything we love causes pain. I asked myself a different question. If everything is temporary, shouldn't I make the temporary magnificent? You sat with your question under a tree. I answered mine across 3 continents.
I want to stay with what you just said. Grief that stops you from acting is just another form of death. There's courage in that. Genuine courage. But there's also something hiding inside it that I'd like you to look at. When your father was murdered, you moved immediately to action. Secured the throne, executed men, planned an invasion. You called that strength. But is it possible, I'm asking, not telling, that the speed of that action was itself a kind of flight? Not from danger, from the grief itself? The man who cannot sit still with his pain will run to the ends of the earth. And from the outside, that running looks like greatness.
You think I ran from grief? I carried it with me across every battlefield. When my closest friend Hephaestion died in Ecbatana, I refused to eat for 3 days. I cut my own hair in mourning, the deepest sign of grief in our culture. I ordered the sacred flames of every temple extinguished, something reserved only for the death of a king. Does that sound like a man avoiding his feelings? I felt everything, Siddhartha. I just refused to let feeling be the end of the story. You seem to think sitting with pain is braver than acting through it. I think that's what people tell themselves when they don't know what to do next. Sitting is not a strategy. It's a surrender that's learned to hold still.
When Hephaestion died, you did all of those things. The hair, the flames, the fasting, and then you launched a military campaign against the Cossians. You told your men it was a funeral offering. An entire people attacked as a gift to the dead. That's not grief expressed, Alexander. That's grief that has found a weapon. I'm not judging you. I am telling you that I recognize the pattern because I've seen it in 1,000 men who came to me broken. The man who turns his pain into action often does extraordinary things, but the pain doesn't actually go anywhere. It just wears a uniform.
You've both watched men suffer and die. What is suffering actually for?
Suffering is the forge. When I took an arrow through my lung at the siege of Mali, my men carried me back to camp half dead. A surgeon cut the arrowhead out without sedation. I could hear the iron scraping my ribs. And I stood up afterward and showed myself to the troops. Because if I didn't, the rumor of my death would have unraveled the campaign. That pain proved something no speech could, that I would pay any price alongside the men I led. Every great thing ever built required someone willing to bleed for it, not just endure suffering, transform it. The question isn't whether you'll suffer, it's whether your suffering will mean anything when it's over.
I sat with a woman named Kisa Gotami, who came to me carrying her dead child. She begged me for medicine to bring him back. I didn't tell her suffering was a forge. I didn't tell her the child's death would make her stronger. I told her to go into the village and bring me a mustard seed from any house where no one had ever died. She went door to door. Every house had lost someone. She came back without the seed, but she came back understanding something. Not because I defeated her grief with logic, but because she saw her own pain reflected in every home she entered. That is what suffering is for. Not to build empires, not to prove toughness, to connect you with every other living being who has ever lost what they loved. Your arrow at Mully proved you were brave. I would never deny that. But bravery and understanding are not the same thing.
That's a moving story. Genuinely. But you sent a grieving mother door to door through a village instead of simply telling her the truth. You could have said, "Your child is gone, and nothing will bring him back." Instead, you made her discover it herself through an afternoon of knocking on doors and reopening other people's wounds. If I did that, you'd call it manipulation. When you do it, it's teaching. We're not so different in our methods, Siddhartha. We just dress them differently.
That's actually quite funny. And not entirely wrong. Perhaps I am more strategic than I'd like to admit. But notice the difference in outcome. She didn't leave angry. She didn't leave wanting revenge on death. She left with peace. Your soldiers left Mali having seen their king nearly die, and they were more afraid than before, not less. You inspired awe. I offered understanding. Awe fades the moment the hero stumbles. Understanding stays because it becomes the person's own.
What makes a person truly great?
What you leave behind that the world cannot ignore. When I reached the oracle at Siwa, crossing 200 miles of Libyan desert, a march that should have killed us all, the priest told me I was the son of Zeus. Now, did I believe that literally? It doesn't matter. What matters is what happened next. My men saw me walk out of that temple changed, taller, more certain. And that certainty carried us through 10 more years of war, desert, and empire building. Greatness is not a private quality, Siddhartha. It radiates. It pulls others beyond what they thought possible. Aristotle was my teacher, and even he never imagined I'd use his lessons to reshape the world. Greatness takes the gifts others give you and returns them 1,000-fold. You returned your gifts by sitting in a forest. I returned mine by building 20 cities and the largest empire the world had ever seen.
20 cities. And tell me, when you burned Persepolis, the most beautiful palace complex on earth, what were you building? When your army slaughtered the men of Tyre and sold the women and children into slavery, what gift were you returning? I don't say this to wound you. I say it because you are describing the bright side of your ledger while the other side sits quietly in the dark. Greatness that requires you to ignore half of what you've done is not greatness. It is a story you are telling yourself so you can sleep. And I think, underneath the certainty, underneath the oracle and the cities, a part of you knows this. Because a man who is truly at peace with his life does not need to march to the edge of the world to prove it was worth living.
And a man who is truly at peace doesn't spend 45 years traveling across India telling people about it. You had your temples and your followers and your Sangha, your own kind of empire, with you at the center. Don't pretend you transcended ambition. You redirected it. Every teacher who gathers disciples is building a kingdom, just one with robes instead of armor. But I'll address Persepolis directly, because I don't hide from it. I burned that palace drunk, regretting it by morning. Tyre, I offered them terms, and they killed my envoys. Was the response proportionate? Probably not. But I was 24 years old, commanding 80,000 men, fighting a siege that lasted 7 months. You want measured wisdom from a young man in the middle of war? I'll take honest regret over pretended enlightenment any day of the week.
Honest regret. That is not weakness, Alexander. That is the beginning of the very examination you claim to reject. Every empire is a sandcastle that has forgotten the tide. But the man who watches his sandcastle wash away and learns something from it, he is more interesting to me than the man who simply builds a bigger one.
Is wanting more the engine of a meaningful life, or the root of all misery?
Before I answer, let me tell you about someone. Before I left for Persia, I visited the most famous philosopher in Greece. He was lying in the street in Corinth, sunbathing naked next to his barrel. My entire retinue, generals, cavalry, attendants, stopped. I walked up to him, the most powerful man in Greece, and I said, "Ask me for anything you want." You know what he said? "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." My officers were furious, but I laughed. I told them, if I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes. I meant it. I understood his freedom. I admired it. And I chose differently anyway. Not because I didn't understand the alternative, but because I did. Wanting more isn't ignorance. Sometimes it's a deliberate choice made by someone who has seen the quiet life clearly and decided it isn't enough.
I'm glad you told me that story, because you've just described my exact point more clearly than I could have. You stood before a man who had nothing and wanted nothing. You recognized his freedom. Your word, not mine. You admired it. Again, your word. And then you walked away from it. Not because you didn't understand, but because the wanting was louder than the understanding. You just call that a deliberate choice. I'd gently suggest it was the opposite. The fact that you still remember Diogenes tells me his peace left a mark your victories couldn't cover. You don't tell stories about the things that don't haunt you, Alexander.
He didn't haunt me. He amused me. There's a difference. I admire a hawk that circles without hunting, but I don't want to be the hawk. I want to be the storm. You keep trying to find a wound underneath my ambition, as if wanting more must come from lacking something. Maybe the healthiest man in the room is the one with the biggest appetite. I wept as a boy when my father conquered a city, because I was afraid he'd leave nothing for me. Not because I was broken, because I was burning with a fire that couldn't wait to start. You'd call that fire a symptom. I call it the purest thing about me. Not every hunger is disease. Some of us were simply born starving for the world.
Perhaps you're right. Perhaps some fires are not symptoms, but nature itself. I've known men like you. Not many, but a few. Men whose energy was so vast that stillness felt like suffocation. I would not try to extinguish that fire. I've never tried to extinguish anything. I only ask, does the fire serve you, or do you serve the fire? You wept at 13 because the world might run out before you could take it. You conquered Persia. Did the weeping stop? Egypt? Babylon? India? At the Hyphasis River, your own soldiers refused to march further, not because they were weak, because they had reached enough. And you stood on that riverbank and wept again. The same tears at 30 as at 13. If the fire was serving you, it would warm you. If you are serving the fire, it will consume you and call the ashes glory.
When my army reached the Indus, we encountered your gymnosophists, naked philosophers standing in a field. One of them stamped the ground and said, "Each man possesses only this much earth." I stopped my entire army to talk to them. My generals thought I was insane, but I recognized something in those men, the same thing I saw in Diogenes, the same thing I suspect I'd see in you, a certainty I will never have. But here's what none of you see, from your fields and your barrels and your trees. That certainty is purchased with smallness. You know exactly who you are because you've narrowed the question. I don't know who I am because I'm still becoming, and I'll take the unfinished painting over the finished miniature every time.
You stopped your army to talk to them. Your generals thought you were insane, and you did it anyway. That tells me more about you than any battle. You keep marching toward me, Alexander, even while arguing against everything I represent. The man who genuinely didn't care about stillness wouldn't stop to discuss it with naked men in a field.
You both lost everything in the end. What was it all for?
Everything. It was for everything. I saw the hanging gardens of Babylon at dawn, the light coming through the water channels, turning the whole structure to gold. I watched the sun set over the Hindu Kush, from a height no Greek had ever reached. I tamed a horse no one else could ride, and he carried me for 13 years. And when he died, I built him a city. I married a woman from a conquered land because I loved her, and my own generals hated me for it. On my deathbed, I told my men to carry my coffin with my hands hanging outside, empty, so the world could see that even Alexander leaves with nothing. But I didn't say that with sadness. I said it as my final lesson. I had nothing, and I had everything, because I had lived. You can't take the living away from me. Not even death can do that.
When I was dying at 80, 50 years older than you'll ever be, my closest disciple Ananda wept beside me. He said, "Who will teach us when you're gone?" And I told him something I'd spent my whole life learning how to say. Be a lamp unto yourselves. Not because I was being poetic, because that was the entire teaching compressed into a single breath. I didn't need my followers to carry my hands outside a coffin. I needed them to stop needing me at all. That is the difference between us, and it is not a small one. Your legacy requires the world to remember Alexander. Mine succeeds the moment the world forgets the Buddha and simply practices what I pointed toward. You gave your men a final image. Your empty hands, beautiful, haunting, but still a performance. I gave my student a final freedom, the permission to walk alone.
A performance? I was dying, 32 years old, burning with fever in Babylon, watching my generals already dividing my empire with their eyes. And with my last strength, I was performing? Maybe you're right. Maybe every great act is a performance. But if it is, then your sitting under that tree was a performance too. Every teaching is a kind of theatre. You chose a quiet stage. I chose a loud one. But we both needed the audience. You just won't admit it.
And I will offer you something most teachers won't. The admission that you might be right about that. I did gather followers. I did teach for 45 years. There is an irony in traveling across India for decades to tell people they should stop chasing things. I see it. Perhaps we are both performers who believed our own performances so completely that they became something genuine. But here is where I want to end, Alexander. You and I are not opposites. You are what happens when a man turns all of his power outward. I am what happens when a man turns it inward. The world needs both directions. The man who only builds never asks why. The man who only questions never builds anything to question. I hope your soldiers found the peace they earned. I hope my monks found the courage they needed. And I hope that whoever is listening to us right now pauses long enough to ask which direction they've been ignoring.
The world does not remember those who let go. It remembers those who held on until their hands bled. But I stood in front of Diogenes and wished I could be him. And I stopped my army to talk to naked philosophers in a field. And I named my horse's city with more love than I named my own conquests. So maybe the world remembers the wrong things about me. And maybe letting go is braver than I'll ever know.